Welcome to Crypt I've Been Thinking. What's this show all about? Well, it's all in the title. He enjoys interviewing people about issues that he finds interesting and which cause him to sit back and think. Cryptocurrency, true crime, natural law, the occult. No topic is off limits here. He has always enjoyed when people give their points of view or thoughts on different topics that they have researched. And what makes it all great is that it's their unique take on what is being discussed. For that reason alone, it makes it interesting to him. So take that walk down to his crypt. Make yourself comfortable. And just maybe, he will be discussing a topic that you have been thinking about. Here's your host, Crypt Rick.
Welcome, everybody. Of course, if you are tuned in, you know it is Monday night right here, and it is going to be an awesome show. I am so excited for this show. It's been in the works and been kind of in the making for a few months, so I get excited when these shows kind of happen, and I get a special guest on, and that is exactly what this show is going to be all about. As you guys know, anyone who has listened to me for any amount of time, I cover lots of different topics, but a couple of the topics I do cover, some of the true crime aspects, I've definitely, the two that I'm big in is the Son of Sam, and then definitely the Zodiac Killer. And those are the two that I seem to be most drawn to, but I've looked into most of these big cases that we've all heard of. But for some reason, those are the two that I just really enjoy researching and hearing and learning about research that other people have done. And that's what this interview is going to be about, is about the Zodiac Killer. I think we've all heard about the myth of the Zodiac Killer. It's apparently a case that is still gone unsolved, even though some people say that it has been. You can find anything you want on the internet if you look deep enough. There's different stories for everything. But I have an amazing guest who is going to be joining me this evening, and I'm so excited to have them here. It's going to be amazing. They have written the book, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, and my guest is Thomas Henry Horan. I call him Professor, so that's what I'm going to call him, as Professor, during this interview. I want to welcome you, Professor, to the show. Let's get into Zodiac. This is one of my favorite cases to dive into, and you have done so much research in this book. You've been a part of the Peacock series, so definitely if you guys get Peacock, go check it out, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. It's a three-part series. Amazing. And so welcome, Professor. This is going to be a great conversation.
Thanks, Rick. I am really excited to be here. I love the opening theme.
Awesome.
I actually, speaking of punk rock, I actually puked with the Circle Jerks once in an alley in Los Angeles. So,
oh, nice.
Yeah, I'm an old punky.
Punk. Me too.
Old
yeah.
Punk rocker. I'm going to mention this once, and I won't talk politics again. I argue Trump is the punk rock president, and I think the last couple of weeks have proven me 100% right.
I've heard,
and
it's kind of weird.
Compliment.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that from a few people, just in kind of like joking. They're like, he's so punk rock. He's like this guy that just, yeah. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, he is definitely different. Doing his own thing.
He's tearing it up.
Absolutely. So yeah, I'm not just say to people, we got 4 years. Let's see. He's made a lot of promises and stuff. So I'm like, okay, well, time will tell. That's the best I can say, is we're going to see if he does what he says he's going to do.
Yeah, takes my breath away for sure. Yeah. So let me tell you the story of the biggest accident that ever happened.
All right, let's get into it.
I was becoming an English professor, and I needed a book, a nonfiction book, and a book that in the English department, we call this writing across the curriculum. You bring in some anthropology, you bring in some history, you bring in some math, you bring in some biology, you bring in some literary criticism, you bring in some political science, and you create something like this, but it's kind of focused on literature of some kind, but it's writing all the way across the curriculum, and we're going to show everybody how it's done. Perfect. So I had remembered this book, Zodiac, that my friend Randy Hargis gave me after he finished reading it. This is back in the late 80s. And he said, oh, you got to read this. This is fascinating. And I remembered there was supposedly the serial killer in the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 1960s who murdered a bunch of young people and wrote letters to the newspaper full of clues and taunts and all this stuff.
Mhm.
And they never caught the guy. I remembered reading about this. And I thought, well, those letters they're literally, some of us are too young to remember and some of us are too old to remember, but there were no comment sections on web pages. Before the internet, you got a paper newspaper or a paper magazine. And if you wanted to comment, you had to write a letter to the newspaper or magazine, to the editor. And they had a page called Letters to the Editor, where these very slow conversations would take place, moderated by the editor. These Zodiac killer letters, number one, they're letters to the editors of newspapers.
Mhm.
So I thought, well, this will be interesting, be a nice contrast between prehistoric comment sections and what we have today. So there's one angle I can attack. Another one was that, if I remembered correctly from reading the book, the only real evidence that this guy existed were the letters. So you could kind of think of him as a literary creation. Kind of like Jack the Ripper. Like there's no evidence for Jack the Ripper except some letters to the newspapers. And so I thought, well, this will be interesting. And I poked around on the interwebs and I noticed that all of the original police department files and Department of Justice and FBI files had become available to researchers online. I thought, well, gee, I happen to have some experience from before I got into education and publishing. I worked in insurance investigation and bank fraud investigation, things like this. And I had a little bit of experience reading police reports from all different parts of the country. And some of them are homicide cases, right? Maybe it's suicide, maybe accident, maybe it's murder. So I had some experience doing some of this. I thought there's some more material that's not just from the English department. And then I noticed that the full texts and some actual pretty high resolution scans of the letters themselves had finally been released, because when Graysmith wrote his book, he only uses very small parts of a couple of letters. I mean, he doesn't publish the text of all the letters. So I thought, well, this might be interesting. And then I realized that the book Zodiac comes out. It kind of is one of the two big books that push the whole idea of the serial killer for the first time. The first book is The Boston Strangler by Gerald Frank. And then Graysmith's book, which I noticed as an English professor rereading it, that he kind of copied the book, The Boston Strangler, chapter by chapter, as the structure of his own book, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, well, this is starting to get interesting. We've got serial killers. We have the invention of the serial killer. And here's a serial killer who, number one, was such a genius he was never caught. And number two, everything we quote unquote know about this quote unquote guy is material from letters he wrote to the editors of the newspapers, usually in response to articles either about his so-called murders or about some other crimes. So I thought, hey, this will be a very interesting project.
For sure.
So I started gathering all this material together, and the problem with the files, the police reports and things, and we're talking about, it turned out to be over 600 pages once I got it sorted out. Nobody had bothered to sort them, collate them, weed out the duplicates, look for missing pages. No one had done that but me. So I had to sit down and I had to read all 600 pages, plus I don't know how many pages of FBI material, plus all these old newspaper clippings, which, thanks to the interwebs, had become more and more available online. So I could really get this context. So I start writing this book where I examine the history of pop media killers, true life. Before they were called serial killers, they were psycho killers, and before that they were maniacs or what. There's always been this character in the news. He's real. And one of the downers was he was always caught eventually, whereas with the Zodiac case, well, they could milk this story forever. So I got, this is getting more and more interesting all the time. And
serial killer. I'm just wanting to say, Professor, that's kind of interesting. I never actually thought of that serial killer. There was names before that. I'm trying to think back when I first heard the term serial killer. Like, when did that even come around? Like,
Well, this, and it turns out, see, one of the myths about the Zodiac case is that supposedly all the Bay Area police departments were not cooperating with each other in the investigation. That's not just a myth. That's a huge lie, because in fact, those police departments there'd been a statewide program initiated by Mel Nicolai at the Department of Justice. He had come back from a seminar taught by the FBI on this newly recognized phenomenon they called a serial killer, a compulsive murderer, and you can have a cluster of unsolved cases that don't look related in the normal way, but it turns out maybe you notice he uses the same weapon or whatever, and maybe we've got these it's a new type of psycho killer.
Right.
So as I do this research, I'm looking at the pop culture, and I'm looking at the big magazines like Saturday Evening Post and Newsweek and Time and Life and the New York Times. I'm reading what they're writing about this. And there's this period of time after World War II where the pop culture, and if you watch the movie, The Boston Strangler, right, it kind of typifies this movie from the 50s and 60s where you feel sorry for the killer. It's not, the victims are just cardboard cutouts. We're all supposed to feel sorry for the killer. The killer was abused as a child or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the letters to the editors pages of these newspapers and magazines, I'm reading a reaction to this. Bullshit, you're coddling these criminals, blah, 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 blah. So I can see how these editors are licking their chops. You know what we need? We need a killer he's crazy, so he's scary, but he's fully conscious of what he does. He knows that what he does is wrong. He does it for the fun of it. He has no remorse. And you can kind of see the silhouette of a new tabloid killer taking shape in the letters to the editors' pages of these newspapers and magazines. And by golly, in 1969, the San Francisco Chronicle, which was a tabloid newspaper, a notorious tabloid newspaper, starts publishing letters and articles about these letters from a guy who is taking credit for some unsolved murders of young people in the Bay Area. And the character, they have these pop psychologists analyze the letters, and they're doing this, and the character of this so-called Zodiac killer that takes shape is exactly what the newspapers had been looking for several years, and we're just waiting for it to come along. So I thought,
Okay.
well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So as I'm wading through these police reports, trying to sort them out, one of the first things I looked for was in Graysmith's book. He starts using the letters as evidence, and he starts ignoring the actual evidence in the cases. He starts using the letters to prove things instead of making the letters prove things. So one of the things was a portion of the letter that was printed in Graysmith's book is one where the writer says, contrary to what the police and the newspapers are saying, I did not leave the scene of the crime on the 4th of July. I did not leave the scene racing my engine, squealing my tires. I left the scene slowly and quietly so as not to attract attention. Well, Graysmith doesn't get around in his book. He doesn't say anything about whether the police can prove that's true or not, because the whole point of Graysmith's book is these letters are genuine, and these letters are evidence of one of the first famous serial killers, and it's the most famous serial killer in America because it's never solved.
That's right.
And he is saying that the actual evidence, and basically the police reports themselves, do verify details in the letters. This is the impression he creates in his book. So one of the first things I looked for were reports from the Vallejo Police Department from the shooting July 4th, 1969. This is Darlene Suennen Farron and her friend Mike Michaud are gunned to pieces in her car in the parking lot at the golf course there in Vallejo, Blue Rock Springs Golf Course. So I looked through those police reports to see if there was a report, because the Zodiac is also claiming, look, if you check with the police, they'll verify everything I'm telling you. So I'm looking at these reports. Is there a report of any kind that suggests that maybe the killer because both the surviving victim, Mike Michaud, and the witness, the son of the park caretaker, he was pretty close by with the windows open, They both agreed that the killer left the scene of the crime, racing his engine and throwing gravel and squealing his tires on the highway when he got out of the park. They both agreed on this. So I'm looking at these police reports, and there's a great big fat one from, actually, there's more than one. There's more than one. Two officers, when the radio dispatch went out, the first unit to respond was black and white with uniformed officers, Mayring and Lindemann. And they observed, now they're arriving at the scene of the crime about 15 minutes after the killer left. This is important. This is 15 minutes after the killer left. As they're coming down the highway, coming up to the entrance to the park, they see this late model Cadillac pull out slow and kind of creep down the highway, and they immediately make a U-turn and pull him over. And after they pull him over, the next unit behind them is an unmarked police car, undercover narcotics officer Richard Hoffman, who doesn't even live in Vallejo. He comes in from out of town, so he's undercover. He stops and he hollers at the two. He hollers at Lindemann and Mayring. He says, "Hold on to that kid. I know him. I want to talk to him." And then he proceeds to the crime scene. Well, this is in Mayring and Lindemann's report. This is in Hoffman's report. And then Conway, the supervisor that night, Sergeant Conway arrives, later Captain Conway, Roy Conway. He arrives, and Hoffman says, "I don't have a radio in my car." Now, this is very important. "I don't have a radio in my car. Could you go back to Mayring and Lindemann, stop and tell them one more, make sure they understand to hang on to that kid." So Conway leaves the scene. He leaves Hoffman alone with the victims. So we have three, and Conway's report verifies this. So we know this for a fact, that the police files do prove that Vallejo police were aware. Now, they cleared Andy pretty quickly, but Vallejo police were aware of a potential suspect who was observed leaving the scene of the crime slowly and quietly. The question that instantly popped up in my mind was, how did the killer know that?
Exactly.
Because
I was just thinking that.
the killer's long gone.
Yep.
The shooting took place about 2 minutes before midnight. Maybe as much as 4 minutes before midnight. Mayring and Lindemann don't arrive and observe Andy leaving the scene of the crime until 12:13, 12:14. It's been over 15 minutes since the killer left. If he's not there, and I checked all the newspapers from that, nothing about this in the newspapers, because number one, Andy was young, and number two, he was an informant. Andy had been shot. We'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
And three, he was cleared. He didn't have the murder weapon in his car, and they didn't find the murder weapon at the scene. So within an hour or so, they figured out that it couldn't have been him. He and his girlfriend had just arrived. They saw Mike and Darlene. They saw Mike all shot up outside Darlene's car, and he turned around and was going to head back to town. But the question is, how could the killer possibly know about Andy? He couldn't have.
He couldn't have. And that's really interesting too. I just want to add, Professor, like when I watched the series, that when you see the crime, it's one thing to read it, but when you see them reenact it, that's what was kind of shocking to me. Like when they show what happened, like what they think happened, and they show like a lot of it doesn't add up. And I just found that I just think the visual is really powerful. So I would suggest that people definitely check out that series on Peacock, because it just gives a visual. And then when you see the crime scene, you're like, okay, this is strange altogether. Like, why did he shoot across the car? It's just a lot of questions.
Well, exactly. And so that was the first big clue that, these letters aren't as authentic as they are made out to be. So then I went ahead and put the real work into sorting and reading and studying all of the reports. And I got a first edition copy of Graysmith's book, and I'm going through and I'm comparing. And after a few months, it became blatantly obvious that, number one, Robert Graysmith had access to these reports when he wrote his book. Right. Number two, he lied about everything in the reports. He lied about what the witnesses said. He lied about what day something happened. He lied about the bullets. He lied about the fingerprints. He lied. The whole book, Graysmith's whole book, is a hoax. It's a myth. The only thing he really gets right is, like, he spells the victims' names correctly. But he lies about every important detail. So as I'm reading these reports, and I've got some experience doing this, I realize that they are telling a very different story from the story that is in every movie and every documentary that you've seen up until now, because everybody has depended on Graysmith's book, which turns out to be nothing but lies. And then what became even more interesting, so as the more I went through it, the more obvious it was that the letters to the newspapers were some kind of hoax. And I'm something of a handwriting expert. I've worked a lot of forgery cases. I've worked a lot of poison pen cases as a private investigator. These letters, Zodiac isn't really a serial killer anyway. Today we'd call him a terrorist.
Good point. Yep.
So like what's the point? Why would somebody, this is more than a prank, because you're rolling the dice here. You might just frame yourself straight into the gas chamber writing these letters if you get caught. And if you're using these files to write the letters, which becomes more and more obvious, that's exactly what he's doing. If you're doing that, any competent investigator is going to know what I know. That's a short list of people. Because it turns out in real life, Mel Nikolai had attended this conference on serial killers. So he comes back and he creates a new program statewide, all across California. Hey, everybody, we got this new thing called a serial killer. And what you want to start doing is you need each one of your departments in an area, like around the Bay Area is a good example. You need to have designated officers who whenever you have an unsolved homicide, maybe a rape, and it goes cold, you need to collect the essential files. You need to make Xerox copies of those, and you need to send them to all the other local police departments. And you need to have a designated officer in every department that collates these reports and make sure they get circulated, and make sure that all the detectives, hey, has anybody noticed any other murders where you've got, right? So this has been going on for about a year and a half before the Zodiac letters start coming in. These police departments have been very actively sharing files on these unsolved murders that this guy is suddenly wanting to take credit for. They're not the only unsolved murders in Solano County during those couple of years, but he's taking credit for certain ones very specifically. And he's making these outlandish threats like he's going to go on a kill rampage. He's going to wipe out a school bus full of kids. He's going to build roadside bombs. This is terrorism stuff.
It absolutely is. Yep.
And so why would somebody, like, okay, a sick prank, and sometimes sociopaths don't think ahead, but he's really put a lot of work into this and he's taking a huge risk. Well, it turns out that the story that those reports actually tell is one of, over and over again, investigators turn up a clue that points to this one particular gang of drug dealers that have hit Solano County like a ton of bricks, and all of a sudden the case goes cold.
That's crazy.
Wow. And then it turns out, so I know what people at home are saying. Well, what about the costume at the lake? What about the message on the car door? What you people don't realize is all of that information had been published in the newspapers 8 weeks before the attack. As a matter of fact, they had printed copies, life-size photo copies of the letters in the newspapers, hoping someone might recognize the handwriting. So a potential copycat would have all the information he needed to pull off the Lake Berryessa attack and pin it on this. He wasn't called Zodiac yet. He was still called the Code Killer or Cipher Slayer. The police had not mentioned the name Zodiac in public at all. And the funny thing is, during the Lake Berryessa attack, he spends all that time talking to the victims. And then he supposedly calls the police and talks to them. Does he ever once remember to say this is the Zodiac speaking? No, he doesn't. That's because he's a copycat. And read the book, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. You can find it on Amazon, either Kindle or paperback. I go through, and for 2 years, I had a blog, Come One, Come All, and we went through every single page of these reports. What does this mean? What does that mean? What's left out? Does anybody know this name? And these reports tell, it's not just that Graysmith's book is a hoax. These reports tell a totally different story from one of a serial killer who's just writing kooky letters to the newspapers. It's a totally different story.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and I think what I'm trying to remember what really got me with this case too, and there's so many aspects of it, Professor, and I know definitely the coded letters were big. I mean, like
Right,
he
right,
sent these codes in, and it took a couple cracked the first one pretty quickly. I thought. I mean, and there's
right.
been a lot of theories that it was somebody I think I heard like in military, and they were like they did code work and stuff like that. Like I mean, this as you well know, it goes. You can go into some deep rabbit holes with Zodiac. Like it goes all over the place. But I just like the way you break. Like I like the way you come at this. That you're going with the evidence. Like and like you were saying, the first book, Zodiac, is to me it's crazy that they never went through all of this stuff that you did, and they just kind of whipped a book out and just it's all
Well,
lies.
here's the thing that Graysmith understood. He'd been working at newspapers since he was 12 years old. He knew all
Yep.
about the newspaper business. And he was not the editorial cartoonist at the Chronicle. That's a lie. He did like 2 editorial cartoons the whole time he worked at the Chronicle.
Okay.
He ran what's called the art department or the production department, where he made the copies of the photographs that were going to be printed in the paper. He photographed the comic strips. He made graphics like maps and illustrations, and he would photograph those and strip the film together to make up the advertising pages, the comic pages. That's what he did. And the Chronicle was a union shop, so he could not double dip as a reporter. Um, but he learned all about the business. So he realized that the cops couldn't say anything. But the funny thing is, um, Paul Avery, a freelance journalist on contract at the Chronicle, he started off writing articles debunking the Zodiac letters. People forget all about that.
Right.
I'm not the first person to do this. Paul Avery was the first person to do this. Then he sees dollar signs. And that, well, Keith Power writes, read the book, read the book. Keith Power wrote an article that Graysmith never mentions in his book. And Keith Power, probably the most respectable reporter they had at the Chronicle. It was a tabloid newspaper.
Hmm.
And so he wrote an article that once again proves that the letters are some kind of hoax and that evidence was tampered with. The evidence at the Lake Berryessa crime scene had been tampered with. The whole crime scene was destroyed by the park ranger who, once again, the first officer to arrive at the scene turns out to be very suspicious. And it turns out that at the time, it's obvious from reading these reports, the park ranger who first makes contact with the victims, he's their first prime suspect.
That's right. That was
And
crazy. That park ranger. You got to break like, cause this is the part that I think most people, Professor, know about Zodiac is the picture. Like
right.
everybody I've talked to, like, oh, that's that guy with the hooded thing, and that's the one they go to. And maybe you can break down what the official report they're going with, and then how I love the way that we kind of dive into this park ranger and stuff, and it's a compelling argument. It's
Well,
really
supposedly, see, in real life, there is no evidence of any kind that links any 2 of these murders together at all. In real life, the witness and survivor descriptions of the killer, it's different in every crime. It's significantly different. It's
that's
a
true.
different person.
Yep.
It's a different person. Number 2, um, what was your question? Oh, about the evidence.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but in this particular crime, so there's no evidence that links any of these murders. So they didn't think they were linked until they got these letters. Now, in real life, in each crime, you really have a different victim profile. Part of the myth is he's attacking couples in lovers' lanes. That's a lie. The only couple that were anywhere near a romantic secluded spot were Brian and Cecilia,
That's right. Yep.
because none of the other victims were anywhere near a lovers' lane. That's where the places that Graysmith describes as lovers' lanes were not. They were very busy public places. That's one part of the problem. Another part of the problem is that the victim profiles are different. The MO is actually different. Like there's a big difference between pulling up on a parked car, getting out of your car, shooting the occupants, getting back in your car, and driving away. That's a huge difference between that and getting into a car, abducting the driver, making him drive to the murder scene, then blowing his brains out. That's two completely different crimes. There is no resemblance between those two crimes at all, and it's not even the same caliber weapon, let alone being the same weapon. There is no similarity between those two crimes at all.
That's so weird that they're
And
linking them.
and right, and so there's just, and then at the very first one, well, supposedly, which is down in Riverside, Sherry Jo Bates, he's waiting for her to come out of the library. She's not on a date with anybody. He found out she was at the library and he waited for her to come out and attacked her. That's what supposedly happened there. Well, that's completely different from all the so-called Zodiac crimes. And then you get David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. There's a parked car involved, but he makes the victims get out of the car first. So in one crime, it appears you have a very, very, very quick, it's a literal hit and run. You pull up, jump out of your car, bang, 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 jump in your car and drive off. In all the other crimes, the killer, and with Sherry Jo Bates, the killer talked to her for 5 to 15 minutes, apparently. So in all of these crimes, the killer spends a considerable amount of time with the victims before the violence ensues. But in Faraday Jensen, that's just, he pops out of a car, shoots. I mean, in Blue Rock Springs Park, he just pops out of a car, bang, 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 pops back in his car and leaves. That's a totally different crime. Then at Lake Berryessa, he flashes a pistol, but again, it's a completely different weapon from the other crimes, and he uses a knife. And for the first and only time, he ties up the victims. And for the first and only time, right, he leaves a written message at the crime scene. So each and every one of these crimes is complete, and there are more fingerprints found than what Graysmith talked about. There's other evidence that's found that rules out the possibility that this is the same person. Maybe it's a group of people working together, but as far as it physically being the same person, there is just no way.
Yeah, the evidence doesn't.
Right. So it's not a serial killer, but it is a terrorist. And there are all these crazy cults going around. This is the exact same time, like on Monday night it's Manson, on Tuesday night it's Zodiac, right? Like all these crimes are happening at the same time. And these cases are hitting the TV at the same time, which is also a very interesting coincidence.
I was going to say that, yeah.
Because the day Charles Manson is booked for the murder of Gary Hinman, that day, the very last, like authentic Zodiac letter, the bus bomb threat is mailed. And that's it. Because the belly letter, I know it has a piece of shirt, but who said it had a piece of the shirt in it? The Chronicle said that, not the police report. So the last so-called real Zodiac letter comes out the day Charles Manson is booked for the murder of Gary Hinman. And it's like because if you look at what happened in the Manson case, Helter Skelter was supposed to start a week earlier. Helter Skelter was supposed to start on August the 1st. Mm-hmm. When the Zodiac wrote that first letter, 3 copies to same letter, handwritten copies, not photocopies. He says, if all 3 of you do not print this cipher on the front page of your newspapers tomorrow, Friday, August 31st, I will go on a kill rampage the next night. Or that night, I'll go on a kill rampage, kill a whole bunch of people. Well, Helter Skelter was supposed to start a week earlier. It was supposed to start on July 31st, but it didn't. Something went wrong. Zodiac never followed through on his threat. The newspapers didn't have time. So it's like, well, either that proves that he's setting up evidence saying, well, I know, like it's not a real threat, or is it because the whole Manson blow up was supposed to happen that weekend? We may never know, but it turns out there are a lot of connections between Zodiac, Manson, and even Son of Sam. So anyway, getting back to Lake Berryessa. So at Lake Berryessa, you really have, because the survivors can really tell us about this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are only 2 crimes where there are survivors who live long enough to talk. Blue Rock Springs and Lake Berryessa. 2 completely and entirely different crimes. There is no similarity between these 2 crimes in the slightest. But at Lake Berryessa, he talks to the victims for a long time. He spends about 15 minutes with them until he finally, and then when the attack begins, he's not like crazy yelling, foaming at the mouth. He's very methodical about what he's doing. So the whole time he's talking to them, he's telling them a lie about who he is. And he keeps telling them, it's okay. I just want the money. I just want the car, but I need, I'm serious now. I'm an escaped convict and all this stuff. Have you ever seen, now do not watch the movie that's based on this because the movie's garbage. Somebody made a low budget movie. But have you ever seen the Leonard Lake, Charles Ng videotapes they made of their victims before they killed them?
No, but I want to now.
Well, if you can find them, they're short.
Okay.
No violence occurs on screen. That's not even the interest. We know these people were murdered because they found their bodies and their bones. So we know that they were murdered. But the myth about him filming the murders seems that maybe is a myth because he leads the victim off camera in the other room, and then you hear something start, then the camera stops, and then we know the person ended up dead for sure. My point is this. He spends 10, 15 minutes talking to the victim in exactly the same way Brian and Cecilia said he talked to them. And the physical description of the killer, including the dark wavy hair, not kinky curly, but dark wavy hair, and the overall build and the size and all of this. And the fact that he's dressed kind of paramilitary and he's carrying a homemade bolo knife and all this stuff. This sounds exactly like Leonard Lake. It sounds exactly like Leonard Lake. And the whole purpose of wearing the costume is, the other thing we know about Leonard Lake is he did supposedly Leonard Lake did film the murders, and then he would trade those films and videos for weapons and grenades and things like this. He operated on the black market, and he did make snuff films, supposedly. Well, was the attack at Lake Berryessa a snuff film made by Leonard Lake? Because it sure sounds like it sounds exactly like his MO. It sounds exactly like he's reading almost from the same script. The two cases are 12 years apart, but he was living in the area at the time. He'd been released from the Navy Psychiatric Hospital and was supposed to be taking his medication. The last entry in his file is he stopped taking his medication. He stopped coming in for his visits. So he lived in that area. And it sounds exactly like something he would do. And the costume would explain, if it was being filmed, and that circled crosshair symbol pins it on the so-called cipher slayer, which I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, boy, that was a lucky break.
Yeah, well, yeah. Yeah.
So it turns out that if you look at the victims, it's exactly like Son of Sam. They're high school and college-age victims, all of them. Some of them are very, he makes sure they're dead. Some of them, he doesn't seem to care whether they're dead or not. It's the attack that counts. There are letters written, goofy letters, some kind of occult connection, and all this brouhaha. I'm some kind of spooky, I'm a wizard, I'm a warlock, I'm a cult fanatic.
Yep.
In both cases. And in both cases, you have young victims that don't seem to be connected. They don't go to the same high schools. They don't live in the same town. They don't work at the same hamburger joint. They look like, and their friends at school they don't understand why this happened. Well, that's because in both cases, the connection is not between the kids. It's not between the victims. The connection is between their parents. Their parents are the connection and the motive. It's a message. It's a warning to the parents and probably to other people of their generation. Keep your mouths shut. Keep your mouth shut about what? That's a very interesting question.
I was going to ask, why? This is interesting.
Well, and then in the Paul Stein murder case, then you get the victim drives the killer to the crime scene. There are no women present whatsoever. He spends a lot of time tampering with the crime scene before he leaves, and for the first time, the next letter comes in with an undeniable piece of the victim's bloody shirt. This looks like undeniable proof that the letters are coming from the killer. The problem is, by the time you get to that letter, the handwriting is different. Any handwriting expert would agree with me. It's a different hand. It's a different hand writing the Paul Stein letter. And on top of that, it turns out that that piece of bloody shirt is not evidence that the letter was written by the killer. That piece of bloody shirt is evidence about how evidence is being tampered with at San Francisco Police Department. Because it turns out, if you read the San Francisco Chronicle, that entire precinct at the hall that also ran the Hall of Justice and the evidence locker and the morgue and all of that stuff, that entire precinct was under a massive internal affairs. Actually, it came from outside internal affairs. They had cops who were not only aiding and abetting burglaries, they were committing burglaries. They were tampering with evidence. They were away from their posts. They were taking all kinds of bribes. That piece of bloody shirt actually proves about the police corruption that's going on. And it proves this thing about this article by Keith Power that you need to read about in the book because we'd be here all night.
Yep.
And all this stuff. So it's like, well, there's something going on. And the drug thing is happening. Maybe it is some big, well-organized drug gang. That would be the mafia. But what about all this occult stuff? And what about all this paramilitary stuff? Like the threat to build a roadside bomb. That's an actual workable design for a roadside bomb. And the guy who invented that, you've seen the movie Apocalypse Now.
Yes. Yes.
Very, very loosely based on the book Heart of Darkness. Read the book Heart of Darkness, and don't worry about the movie. But the movie is supposedly based on this real life Colonel Kurtz named Anthony Poshepny, Tony Poe, right? The movie Apocalypse Now, Colonel Kurtz, this rogue Green Beret colonel who goes a little crazy and sets himself up as a god and has his own little army, and he's single-handedly winning the Vietnam War. You've seen that movie, right?
Yes.
People have said, John Milius has said, well, yeah, sort of, kind of, that the character of Colonel Kurtz, he's totally different. He's totally different from the character of Kurtz in the novel. Both the novel and the movie are masterpieces. You must read the novel. It's short, and you must watch the movie. Movie's loosely based. The real life Colonel Kurtz is supposedly CIA case officer, field agent Anthony Poshepny, known as Tony Poe, who worked Laos, Cambodia. He was helping Vang Pao and the Hmong rebels fight off the Viet Cong, as like a third party independent paramilitary army. That was Tony Poe's job. Well, to make a long story short, the real life Colonel Kurtz was from World War II. His name is Colonel Wendell Fertig, Fertig. He's the one that Douglas MacArthur gave him direct orders twice, stop winning the war in the Philippines, because U.S. government policy did not want the Filipinos to be able to chase the Japanese out of the Philippines by themselves. He wanted them to depend on American help. Twice, he directly ordered Wendell Fertig to stop winning the war. Jeez. And Wendell Fertig, like his predecessor, General John Blackjack Pershing, commander of the Buffalo Soldiers in the Philippines during the Philippine uprising, they were initiated into a Moros. Well, the Moros are one of the tribes. They were initiated into a Filipino death cult, a warrior cult. The infidels, the enemies I have killed, will become my slaves in paradise. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. Right? The more I looked into what really happened, what the real motives for the murders might have been, what the victims' stories were really all about, the more I looked into that, the spookier it got. And we now know, looking back, that the CIA working with drug smugglers or sometimes working against drug smugglers, everybody's playing both sides of the street. Maybe this has something to do with that. So I narrowed it down, the person who could have written the letters. It was obviously one of the officers assigned to receive and collate and pass along these very same police reports. It had to be either one of those officers or a well-connected reporter. And the best connected reporter in the Bay Area, actually, at that time, was Bob Pop at the San Francisco. Actually, he was in the Oakland PD. He was a reporter, and there was because Graceman talks about him, but lies about him in his book. His name was Bob Pop, P-O-P-P. And then he went from the Oakland Police Department to the San Francisco Police Department, but that was after the Zodiac case. So anyway, the other great investigative reporter in the Bay Area was Dave Peterson at the Vallejo Times-Herald, and he also edited the Vallejo News-Chronicle. So he had deep connections in the San Francisco FBI office. I mean, he had connections everywhere. And
That's
he
really,
could,
it's really
he,
interesting. Go ahead.
theoretically, he was on the list of people who could have done it, could have written these letters. But it was a very, very short list. And obviously, the person writing these letters knew something about the newspaper business. And then it became obvious from reading all the newspaper articles and all the so-called Zodiac letters, it was obvious he lived in Napa County because he read the Napa Journal, the Napa Sentinel, and the Napa, he read all three little Napa newspapers. He read the San Francisco Chronicle. He read the San Francisco Examiner, and he read the Vallejo Times-Herald, but he did not read the Vallejo News Chronicle. And the Vallejo News Chronicle was not distributed in Napa County. So he lived in Napa County. I knew that. And the officer at Napa County designated to coordinate these reports was Deputy Hal Snook, who had created Napa's very own forensics crime lab. He became a famous forensics expert in California. He's the guy who collected he didn't collect all the evidence in the Cecilia Shepard Brian Hartnell case. That's the thing. The funny thing is, one of his former students, Park Ranger Dennis Land, he was one of the first cops in California to get a degree in criminal justice, and one of his instructors at Napa Valley Junior College was Hal Snook. And after excellent training from one of the nation's top forensics experts, he had cases upheld by the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. I'm not joking.
This is crazy.
Dennis Land, then he has 8 years experience as an MP on a big military base in Stuttgart, Germany. So he's a very experienced cop. He completely destroys the crime scene and tampers with all the evidence.
That was so crazy when I learned that. Like and that's the one thing everybody knows that you don't,
Right.
Anybody listening is like, you don't touch the crime scene until they investigate it. Not this guy. He destroyed it.
And his own teacher, who taught him not to do that, apparently doesn't seem to have a problem with it. And his own teacher apparently is the guy who's writing the Zodiac letters. So I get copies of his handwriting from 1969, and there's no difference whatsoever between his handwriting and the Zodiac killer letters, especially those first couple of Zodiac letters. And then from that point on, it's obvious that somebody is forging the Zodiac handwriting. That includes the Melvin Belly letter. I think Hal did write the bus bomb letter because. So I'm like, who the hell is this guy? Why would a cop do this? So when I say I'm of course referring to the royal we. I have an army of people who assisted me over the years in this. And Evan from Texas got hold. This was lucky. Hal Snook's military records were intact, both from his Army service in World War II and his Air Force service in the 50s. So Evan got me his entire DD 214. I'm looking at his academic record. He did very well in high school. He got 4 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart in jungle warfare during World War II. He fought on Mindanao and he fought in the Philippines, or he fought in Mindanao and he fought in New Guinea. And his job was combat engineer. He was trained, probably personally. The guy who invented that roadside bomb in the Zodiac letter was Colonel Wendell Fertig. And the army he commanded during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, the resistance army, which grew to 50,000, were officially called the Philippine Scouts. Not all the 50,000 are listed as Philippine Scouts, but they were officially Philippine Scouts. And Hal Snook's final posting was to the Philippine Scouts. And then I got his complete military records. After the war, he goes to San Jose State and majors in journalism, which is Spycraft 101. Who, what, where, when, and how. And then as an analyst, you come up with the theories of why. But as a spy, you start out as a journalist. Journalism is the perfect training. And then he worked at several little half bankrupt small town newspapers in Northern California, where he learned to do every job in the house. He knows all about the newspaper business. And then eventually he kind of gives up on his dream and joins the Napa Police Department. He creates their radio dispatch room and trains his replacements, including Officer Slate, David Slate, who took the call from Zodiac. And then he moves over to the sheriff's office and he creates their forensics laboratory. And he's a nationally recognized expert in forensics, and especially like forensic chemistry. So, but he's a fingerprint expert. He's got all the equipment. So half the evidence collected in the Zodiac case was collected by Hal Snook, and the other half was destroyed by his protege, park ranger Dennis Land, who, based on his own report, plus the park ranger radio dispatcher's report, he completely frames himself for being the attacker, except that maybe his weight is a little too light. The attacker is described, sounds more like Leonard Lake's body type. If you look at Dennis Land from those days, he's a lot more slender. He's a lot more athletic. He's tall enough, and he wears size 10 shoes. But little things like the Wing Walker shoe prints, these rare Wing Walker soles, no, they weren't. They were the single, and still are. They still make those soles. They were the number one brand by a country mile brand of non-slip uniform shoes. They were sold to cops as Academy brand shoes. They were sold to military personnel as Wing Walkers. They were sold to janitors as something else. It was the most common non-skid sole sold in America at that time. Half the Napa deputies probably wore shoes with those soles. So it's just another one of those myths. And Hal Snook is the one collecting this evidence.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, the thing is, his handwriting is a perfect match. He's a cop who has access to all the necessary reports. Then it turns out he not only is a combat veteran from World War II, he's a veteran of elite, like behind the lines combat units. They're blowing up trenches and they're blowing up gun installations. And I think he actually he like built bridges and things, but you're under fire all the time. Four Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. He survived a kamikaze attack. He was wounded in a kamikaze attack on his outfit. So this guy, and he gets all this code training, all this chemistry. He knows all this battlefield chemistry. The Zodiac letters contain a bunch of so-called misspelled words. They're not misspelled. They're correctly spelled chemistry words, and they are specifically related to battlefield chemistry. So, okay, this is the guy. And his commanding officer, the real-life Colonel Kurtz, taught him how to build roadside bombs. He actually trained. Apparently, he was training other guys. He did not go behind the lines. He trained other guys, mostly natives, like native Filipinos. He trained them. Guys who belong to this, it's supposed to be, it supposedly passes as a sect of Islam, but it's not. It's Tibetan Buddhism.
Okay.
It's related to the Thuggee cult in India, this whole death cult. The infidels I have killed, the infidel warriors, the infidel enemies I have killed will become my slaves in paradise. So he knows about it. And as a matter of fact, the Zodiac letters have some of these weird symbols, and the codes have some weird symbols in them, right? Well, those are very recognizable letters of the Cebuano alphabet. And as a matter of fact, they come from a very specific dialect of Cebuano called Askaya, from the Askaya natives on Askaya Island in the Mindanao island chain, who have been friends with undercover American operatives since the 1800s. And these are the people he makes contact with, and he trains and he supports in the field against the Japanese. And he'd done this in the jungles of New Guinea as well. So he knows all about the Zodiac. He's working one of the Zodiac cases. He's maybe one of the most competent he and Don Townsend had joined the Napa Sheriff's Office at the same time. They had a hiring sweep. Don Townsend's only unsolved homicide on his books is Cecilia Ann Shepard. He was one of the best homicide detectives in the whole Bay Area, and he joined. He gave up one career and became a cop. He and Hal Snook gave up their careers and became top cops. They became crackerjack cops. Well, get a load of this. Not only in high school, not the same high school, but like cross-county rivals, like when you play football, you're playing football against your rival, right?
Mm-hmm.
From high school, not during the war, but immediately after the war, two guys go to San Jose State. They're both in the English department. They're both majoring in journalism, and they both live at this guy's aunt's house. His name is Anthony Poshepny, Tony Poe, one of the most famous CIA spooks of all time. And he's friends with Hal Snook. And I'm sitting, and then Hal Snook, after he gets his degree, then he goes Air Force for a couple of years as an officer. He washes out. He doesn't make captain. He goes in. He's actually in charge of an MP, a company of MPs. Well, Air Patrol.
Right.
But
Hold on
he's
1 sec, Professor, because we got break coming up. I don't
Okay.
mean to cut you off, but we will continue after this break because I know it's coming up. Please stick around. We're going to be back for hour 2. Of course, we are speaking to Thomas Henry Horan. He is the author of the book, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, an amazing book. I suggest it. And we're going to be back for hour 2 to dig even more into this. This is getting, people are probably going, wow, Zodiac Killer was confusing before this. And now we're seeing how deep this case may go. And there's a lot of evidence for it. So we're going to be back for hour 2. Please stick around. It's going to be a good one, guys.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And we'll be right back after this message.
Tune in to the Family Industrial Complex podcast here on Revolution Radio, Studio B, every Wednesday, 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Get fit, empowered, physically, mentally, and spiritually.
Interrupt your normally scheduled programming to bring you this important broadcasting announcement.
Now is the time to explore your greatest potential, embracing truth, health, and wellness while discarding the system and exposing its corruption. Experience true freedom every Saturday night between 6 and 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Live from Studio B, it's the Jonathan Wright Show.
Find it right here at revolution.radio.
Welcome to Coffee Rants with Dan. I am the spiritual anarchist, Dan Arnold, your host. Tune in for what's really happening every Thursday. That's Thursday at 9 a.m. in Studio A on Revolution Radio. They keep us in fear to manipulate us. They want us ignorant so we're easier to enslave. They make us murder one another so they don't have to do it themselves. Only you can break their mind control by healing the contradictions within your belief systems that allow you to accept their lies in the first place. The time has come for us to remember our divinity, who we really are, to return to what we are meant to be, a service to others, to return to nature, and to reclaim our birthright, that which is freedom. The truth will sound belligerent because it is in direct opposition to lies. So get angry, because anger is sacred, and together we can unite and rise. Rise from this darkness. Humanity, assemble.
Fire. Crosstalk with Sarah Cross, a place for radio wanderers to learn about the highest laws and other related topics, with the occasional stroll through more relaxed notions. Every Wednesday, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern, or 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Crosstalk with Sarah Cross, Studio A on Revolution Radio.
I will defend myself against their tyranny. Number 3 is my radio broadcast. I'm squarely in front of the public all the time, and they all know what's going on.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on the means for expanding its sphere of influence.
Hello, my name is John Wayne, and I do a broadcast here at freedomslips.com, revolution.radio, called The Unequivocal Truth, DEFCON 1.
Freedom and fear are at war.
And folks, I assure you, we are in Defense Condition 1, as we journey perilously through this paradigm that we currently reside in. And I ask that you join me every Saturday, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for The Unequivocal Truth, DEFCON 1.
We'll never surrender.
The original machine had a base plate of prefamulated amulite, surmounted by a malleable logarithmic casing, in such a way that the two spurving bearings were in a direct line with a panometric fan. The lineup consisted simply of 6 hydrocoptic Marsal vanes, so fitted to the ambifacient lunar wane shaft that side fumbling was effectively prevented. The main winding was of the normal Lotus O deltoid type, placed in panendermic semi-boloid slots of the stator, every 7th conductor being connected by a non-reversible Tremi pipe to the differential girdle spring on the up end of the gram meters.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio, taking the confusion out of transmutated lunar girdle springs for 4 years and running. Revolution Radio, the #1 listener-supported alternative media radio on the planet. All right, thanks for listening while we take that short break here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. And now we're going to get back to your host.
Welcome back, everybody. There you go. First hour down. I told you it wasn't going to be a long break, and I hope you're sticking around because we are going to have a great hour 2. But before we do, I want to give a special shout out. I know there's 3 ladies I was informed that are tuning in and listening. So I want to say hello to you. I hope you're having a great time. And, you know, I'm sitting here having myself a nice cold can of Coke, and I'm learning all about Zodiac Killer. It's amazing. So thank you guys for tuning in. That is awesome. And let's get back to my guest. As I was saying at the first hour, he is author of the book, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, which I cannot recommend enough. This gets into a whole side that we are kind of touching on right now, but there's so much more to get into. You have to get the book, check out the series on Peacock, and you're going to see there's a whole side to this case, which the professor is definitely getting into. And I'm sure in the second hour, we're going to dive into it a little bit more. So, Professor, welcome back to the second hour. This case it gets so deep, and there's so many branches to it. Now we're getting into military connections. You got CIA spooks, you got police. And the one thing I would like to tell people that I found really interesting too is when you look back at the connection between police and the media back at that time, you know, they were really connected. Like, I found that really interesting. Like, you know, because people are like, well, how would they have all access to this information and all of that? It's not like it is now, I think, where there's like, you know, it's not as easy. But back then they were really working. They would work closely together. Am I correct in that assumption?
Oh, absolutely. Reporters like Dave Peterson, who could take shorthand, would actually take witness statements, or they would take calls over the phone and write reports.
That's crazy, yeah.
Or cops would hand them their handwritten reports, and reporters would type them. Then the reporter gets to keep a carbon copy, and that's where they get the article. So, like, you can see this in the Zodiac case. Reports typed by Vallejo cops, or I think they're actually typed by Dave Peterson, they show up in the newspaper almost verbatim. except for the little pieces they got to cut out. So that was going on. They joked in San Francisco that Bob Pop was an honorary cop. He was just nothing but a reporter. Sometimes reporters competed against cops to crack cases. Paul Avery was involved in some cases like this where they're actually racing against the cops to crack the case first. So they're interviewing suspect witnesses, even suspects, even confessions. There's a reporter. They're the only ones who know shorthand. They're the ones who are taking down the confessions. So they worked very closely. And speaking of which, you have this cop who was also a journalist named Hal Snook.
Right.
And he's friends with famous spook Tony Poe. They went to school together, so on and so forth. And so I'm looking, and so he joins the Air Force. He's studying radar navigation. He's studying polar coordinates, like you see in the map code. He's studying, he studied something else. And then he joins the Civil Air Patrol. Do you know about the Civil Air Patrol?
No, but I want to hear about it.
Absolutely saturated with pederasts. These are adult men who have inappropriate relationships with preteen boys, like not little tiny boys, but like right on the verge of puberty. They're like their puberty mentors. That's how they see themselves. So that's the Civil Air Patrol. Well, David Fernie and is it Lee Harvey Oswald were both members of the same chapter of the Civil Air Patrol. And David Fernie pops up in the Barry Seal Iran-Contra stuff, right? So that's Civil Air Patrol. When you see the aerial photographs of the Lake Berryessa crime scene, those were taken by Hal Snook. The pilot of that plane was, his name is Stewart. His son was Bucky Stewart, who became Napa County Sheriff at one point. And his son was involved in narcotics trafficking. And several guys have come forward and acclaimed Bucky Stewart of molesting them when they were little boys. And his father was, what's that guy's name? Stewart. They don't own this ranch anymore. They're famous in Napa County. They have the Oreo cows. They have a special breed of, not Guernsey, Jersey cows. These huge dairy cows. They're called Oreo cows. They're beautiful black and white cows. So anyway, he has a private airstrip on his land. He's a member of the Civil Air Patrol. He's also in the freshman class, the very first group of sex offenders that were registered in California's state sex offender registry. And he's the guy flying the plane that Hal Snook is riding in, taking these aerial photographs of Lake Berryessa crime scene. I only bring it up because back in 1963, is that right? 62, 63, a little girl named Doreen Heskett was abducted and murdered in Napa. And 8 months later, Mr. Stewart, flying in his plane from his private airstrip on his farm, is flying over his farm and he spots the body in his pasture and collects the reward. Now, her brother will tell you, we got on our hands and knees and crawled over that cow pasture twice looking for evidence, and we never found my sister's body out there. And the medical examiner said that it looked like the body had been stored indoors for several months and then had been placed in the cow pasture. Well, Mr. Stewart, the registered sex offender, member of the Civil Air Patrol, he goes to a meeting, a town meeting or county meeting, and he said there's a reward offered for the finding, and he makes them double down on that and sign a piece of paper that if he finds the body, he gets the reward. He finds the body on his own ranch and collects the reward. Now, the only reason I bring all that up is because of the map code. There's a letter with a Phillips 66 map. It said the code. Then there's another letter comes in and says the code concerns radians and inches along the radians. Well, it's very simple instructions, actually. Supposedly, Zodiac is keeping score, like Zodiac 5, San Francisco Police 0. If you take the clue literally, that the code is radians and inches along radians, and you follow the instructions that are written on the map, it's a Phillips 66 station highway map. If you do that, if you take those scores and you make those inches, there's a scale of inches on this map. I think it's 6.72 miles to the inch. And if you follow the instructions, you come back 8 degrees left of magnetic north, which in those days, you have to, the North Pole moves. So I looked up where magnetic north was. Then you get, and there was a guy, an actual crazy guy, who stumbled over a little bit of this, Gareth Penn. And he said it had something to do because the crime scenes line up. If you start at Mount Diablo, like the map code says, if you start at Mount Diablo and you follow this radian, all the crime scenes line up along this one particular radian. If you go 8, because it says on the instructions say 8 degrees left of magnetic north. If you start there and you come back exactly 1 radian, which is 57 point something degrees. If you come back 1 radian, now these are polar coordinates. This is how radar works and how Snook studied this when he was in the Air Force. If you start at Mount Diablo and you follow that particular radian, not only do the crime scenes line up, but if you go the scores that are written down, like 5, 7, 37, you come to not only the crime scenes based on that, inches along those radians on that map, it's 6.71 miles to the inch, but there's a Christmas card that comes in 1990 that's supposedly from Zodiac.
That was weird. Yeah, I remember.
And it has a Xerox copy of a set of post office box customer keys. That post office box, police investigators discovered belonged to a man named Chester Klingle Jr., who lived all the way up in Eureka, California. The card was mailed from Eureka, California. But that's not the funny thing. The funny thing is, if you follow that radian for 37 inches, multiply that out, you come to a spot that's within less than 200 meters of Chester Klingle's home address in Eureka, California. And not only that, but when Hal Snook was attacked by the kamikazes, the transport ship his unit was loaded on were attacked by kamikazes for 2 days and 2 nights when they first reached port off the coast of the Mindanao Islands. And the sailor, according to his military records, the merchant marine who apparently saved Hal's life, but he's on the same ship, was Chester Klingle Jr.
This is so much deeper, Professor, than people, I think, realize.
So I'm looking at Hal Snook's... I'm looking at his academic records and his military records, and I am looking at a first-round draft pick of the CIA, just like Tony Poe, who, frankly, didn't have as many skills, but had more behind-the-lines combat experience. Tony Poe was wounded, seriously, several times. And they're friends. One guy joins the CIA, and the other guy doesn't join the CIA, but then it turns out my fellow researchers have turned up the evidence, and a lot of it's been declassified now, that the CIA were running covert operations on American soil as well.
That's right. Yeah.
Was Hal Snook working for Operation Chaos? Because what is the purpose of these letters? The purpose of these letters is to sow the seeds of terror and to get 2 coded messages published on the front page of the Chronicle. That was really the only demand he ever made, was publish these ciphers on the front page of your paper and everything would be kosher. Well, what was so important about that? That he would risk framing himself for murder. Yep. Framing himself for murder. Why would he risk doing that? There must have been something important about those coded messages, one of which is very easy to decrypt. So it looks like it's just a kid's puzzle, or like it's a very simple puzzle, very simple cipher. But the other one remains uncracked for a long time. But Hal Snook knows all about that cult. He knows all about those roadside bombs. He never says a word to the authorities. Hey, I think I might be able to give you a profile of this guy. Because for one thing, it would point at him. Except he's not big enough to be the killer at Lake Berryessa. So, and I'm sure he has alibis for the other murders. So why doesn't he say anything? Why doesn't he knows all about the Zodiac. When he shaves in the morning, he's looking at Zodiac. Zodiac is a guy exactly like him. And I mean, there are 20,000 Filipinos who live in the San Francisco Bay Area. None of them come forward with the tip either. Was it a message to them to keep their mouth shut about something? Well, if he's friends with Tony Poe, and it turns out that one of Tony Poe's little personality quirks, say that 3 times fast, Tony Poe's personality quirks. One of his quirks was he would throw a fit if he didn't get his copy of the San Francisco Chronicle in a timely fashion. So Tony Poe saw both of those Zodiac ciphers when he was in country in Laos and Cambodia, behind the lines, working with Vang Pao and the Green Berets. He saw those ciphers, and he knew how to crack them. And it turns out that his buddy is the guy who's writing the codes and getting them published in his favorite newspaper. That's quite a coincidence. Because if those two wanted to communicate, they would know that the CIA be looking over their shoulders. So if they want to set up their own private communication network, it better be damn clever. And it can't be something you set up with a stranger. It has to be somebody you know, and you're saying, hey, man, if you make it in the CIA, here's what we'll do. We'll have this little code of ours, and we'll know what's ours when we bring up this cult or whatever. Well, what message could possibly be being sent back and forth? Maybe it's a very simple start and stop. Maybe that's all it is. Well, it turns out that Hal Snook was an expert in a technique that's illegal now. What they would do is the cops would take a batch of drug, whether it was meth or heroin or coke or whatever, and they would spike it with a harmless chemical. Then, as different police departments bust users, they bust nickel and dime dealers, they put out a bulletin. If you pick up any coke lately, do this test, and if you get a positive result, send us a sample of it. This is something that Hal Snook sets up. He creates the California Narcotics Officers Association. He goes around the state and he teaches them how to do this. And he teaches them a very simple test. If you can take a very tiny amount of heroin, very tiny amount of cocaine, very tiny amount of meth, and you take a tiny little drop of hydrogen peroxide from the corner drugstore. You probably got one in your first aid kit here at the police station. If you do that, it will turn a very distinct lavender purple. It's no mistaking it. If that happens, type up a report and send me a sample and send me a copy of the case files, because we're keeping track of this distribution network. And there are cases. There's actually one of the Perry Mason novels is based on a case where the cops do this. Well, one of the Zodiac letters mentions, I'm mildly serious how much money you have on my head now. Serous means serous oxalate, which has several uses. Number one, it's used to polish gems and rocks. If you ever had a rock polishing kit when you were a kid, or you take your gems into the jewelry store to have them polished, they use serous oxalate to do that. Hal Snook's hobby after he retired was he became a rock hound and a fossil hunter. I used to own one of his fossil fish that he dug in Montana and Wyoming. So he used serous oxalate. The guy who taught him how to use serous oxalate, we'll have to do another episode about that, because there's another murder you never heard of that makes the Zodiac murders look like a Disney movie.
Oh,
and
wow, definitely.
Hal Snook is not only the guy who comes across the county line to help him out doing some of the forensics works, but he knows the family very well. So another thing about serous oxalate is that it can be used as it was used by spooks in the middle 20th century to the late 20th century as invisible ink. And I think there's at least one Zodiac letter where I think I can make out, looks like there's some invisible ink. There's some writing written in invisible ink, but I can't make out enough of it to make any sense of it. But it was used as invisible ink, and its third use before Dramamine. It was called kamikaze juice, kamikaze hooch. They put this, you could put this in a glass of sake, and a kamikaze drinks it, and this substance, serous oxalate, suppresses the fear of death.
Okay, and that's really interesting.
And it was used as a treatment for air sickness and motion sickness, but it suppresses the fear of death. And they used to give this to kamikaze pilots. Well, if you take a small, otherwise it's harmless. It's non-toxic. It was given as a medication. If you put a very small amount of this in a batch of heroin, and that heroin hits the streets of America, and you've trained all these local police departments, every time you bust a junkie, I want you to do this. It's cheap. You could do 1 million of these tests with one bottle of peroxide. Just put one teeny tiny drop of peroxide on one teeny tiny flake of that drug, and if it turns purple, send me a sample and send me a report, please. Because Tony Poe in the fall of '69 is making a lot of noise about Vang Pao and some of the American CIA and military officers all lining their own pockets with the money that's being made from this heroin that's being farmed and manufactured and sold by Vang Pao to buy the weapons. This is the first Iran Contra. Congress has shut off funding. They won't want to sell any more weapons and won't won't give any more weapons to the Mongs or any of the other anti-communist guerrillas. So they are selling heroin, and they're using that heroin to buy weapons from the CIA, including but not limited to weapons that had been stolen from his own base by Leonard Lake when he was in the Marine Corps in Vietnam. He is stealing weapons and selling them on the black market to CIA guys who are selling them to the Hmong rebels in Cambodia. And Hal
so
Snook's
corrupt.
buddy, Tony Poe, is blowing the whistle on this. Well, after that second cipher's printed in the newspaper, it was printed November 9th or whatever, 1969, Tony Poe is suddenly demoted. And I don't think he's demoted, but they yank him out of the jungle and they park him behind a desk in Bangkok, Thailand. And the only reason I bring that up is because that's the same month. It's the same month when the Vang Pao's gang, who have their guy at the U.S. Air Force Base in Bangkok, Thailand, where they're bringing the heroin across the border out of Vientiane, and they're bringing it to this Air Force Base by hook or by crook, and then it's being loaded on the transports and going back to the Philippines and on its way back to the States. When that happens, those guys get busted thanks to Tony Poe. You know, he always bitched about it being a demotion, but it almost kind of sounds like a promotion. But to make a long story short, that guy's replacement at the Air Force Base, the one who makes sure the heroin gets through, because it's not like cocaine. A small briefcase full of heroin is worth an incredible amount of money. A little bit of heroin goes a long way. Yeah. So his replacement at that Air Force Base is named Ike Atkinson. Does that name ring a bell?
Yeah.
He had a cousin back in New York City in Harlem who had a street level heroin distribution operation.
I can't believe how this is going. Like this.
And by the way, a mechanic who worked at that Air Force Base for 2 tours of duty, worked there for 6 years. He left that Bangkok Air Force Base in December of Christmas holiday 1974, and he arrives back in the States in early January. He leaves around Christmas, he arrives around New Year's, and a couple of weeks later, Frank Lucas is busted and Ike Atkinson is busted. And the jet mechanic who coincidentally came back at that time was John Carr from the famous Son of Sam case. His father is supposedly Sam Carr, supposedly the son of Sam Carr.
This is all linked, right? Like this is
exactly.
This is such a spider web of like, this is really deeper than I even thought it went. Like
all because so then my blog is like, nobody's on the blog anymore and blah 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 blah. So I start and I'm getting a lot of attention from networks and studios and agents and people. So for practice, I decided to start a YouTube channel, podcast, but YouTube was free. So I did YouTube and I know how to make videos. And I got on there and I said, I used to have a blog. We used to do Zodiac. Now what I'm asking for you people is, we'll crowdsource this thing. I need you people to teach me about Manson, Son of Sam. And then right after the Zodiac story dies down and fades out, you get the zebra murders in San Francisco, where you have black radical Muslims murdering white Christians.
Yep.
Calling themselves death angels because they belong to this exact same cult that's in the Zodiac letters and ciphers, and none of these investigators pay any attention to that. What's going on here? And then you get the phony kidnapping of Patricia Hearst. And then very quickly after that, you get Son of Sam. And in Son of Sam, it's the same thing. It's not the kids, it's their parents. So I start this podcast. I'm like, you people tell me, and I'll present what we find on my podcast. And we'll look for links between, because Dave Peterson went to his grave screaming that Zodiac and Manson were linked. Well, they were. Well, so there's this guy named Tom O'Neill who has written a book called Chaos about Manson, and he did the exact same thing. he found out, he got a hold of, Bugliosi. See, there's another bullshit book about Manson called Helter Skelter, written
Helter
by
Skelter.
Bugliosi,
Yeah.
right? And Bugliosi's boss was Neville Younger, who was deep in the CIA, and he's also he's either grandson or great nephew or something of Cole Younger, of the James Younger gang. Blah 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 blah. He uncovers all that stuff about Manson, and it turns out, Bugliosi walked off with all the original police reports and autopsy reports, and nobody saw him since. Well, Tom O'Neill apparently somebody got hold of him, okay? And those police reports and those autopsy photos and all that evidence all disprove the entire story of Helter Skelter. In real life, the Manson family didn't murder anybody. Apparently, all they did, for whatever bizarre reason, was tamper with the crime scenes. You get the same story. So looking at that, it's not so much the kids, it's their parents. And the LaBiancas, of course, they owe all kinds of money to the mob. So, and then you get to Son of Sam, where recently all the original police reports in that case have come out, and they are telling a very different story from the one that we've heard about David Berkowitz being a lone psycho who kills all these people for no reason. It turns out, so to make a long story short, in the Zodiac case, the connection is to parents. The parents are all involved in very secret defense work. Like Darlene's father is installing these super top secret underwater cameras and underwater sonar rigs and all this fancy stuff on the submarines in Shed X-38 at Mare Island. And he's installing devices that are being built by Sherry Jo Bates's father, Joseph Bates, who's an engineer machinist who works at the Corona Naval Laboratory down in Riverside, California. That's how those cases are connected. But for some bizarre reason, Paul Avery, of all people, comes up with this bullshit connection between Sherry Jo Bates and the Zodiac crimes. But there is a real connection, and it actually tells us what the motive really is and who the suspects might really be. Because not only... So then you have David Faraday's father, who works with the military to supply them at Mare Island terminal, supplying aircraft carriers not just with jet fuel, but also napalm and Agent Orange and all this stuff. He's in charge of all that. He's in charge of the civilian side of that, all the pipelines that have to be used by the military. And then Betty Lou Jensen's father, who was stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado, where they do chemical warfare. And during the Vietnam War, we're talking about napalm primarily and Agent Orange. He's the guy who's hired by PG&E because he's ex-military. And so he has the security clearance. He has the skills. He can deal with people like David Faraday's father, that kind of thing. I may have gotten one because with Darlene's father-in-law, Dean Farron's father, he did the electronics on the submarines and like spy ships, like the Leto and they're involved in Castro, Cuba, Kennedy, the Leto and the something else. They were built these were freighters that were refitted at Mare Island. They do all that work. So that's how they're connected. Why would somebody target their kids? What is it those two guys are supposed to keep? What are they supposed to keep their mouths shut about? Well, here's the thing. Doing this podcast for the last 5 years and working with my listeners, it's called the Stones Unturned Podcast. You can find it on YouTube. What we've uncovered is you've heard of the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg spy ring, right?
Yes.
The focus has always been on the nuclear secrets.
That's
because
right.
Ethel's brother, Howard Greenglass, worked at Los Alamos, and he's an engineer machinist, and he actually manufactured one of the sections of the implosion device for the Fat Man bombs. So he passed along blueprints and things. Julius's job was to travel all over the country to all kinds of defense plants and do quality control on all these top secret projects. This includes radar. This includes like radar guided torpedoes, that kind of stuff, radar guided missiles. So he had access to a huge network of machinists and engineers who could supply him with blueprints. That would have included Darlene's father and father-in-law. That would have included Joseph Bates. But it also would have included, like all these cases, one of the big things that ties them together is not necessarily that these people were deliberately spying against America, but maybe they were duped, they were used by Rosenberg, or they knew Rosenberg. And so there's a warning being sent to them, you better keep your mouths shut. Now, why would this happen? Maybe because May Brussel and that other guy had made all this noise about Kennedy and the CIA, and it turns out these recently declassified documents, when Oswald lived in Russia, he lived in Minsk, which was Russia's Silicon Valley, the Soviet Union Silicon Valley. He worked at the Gorizet plant, working on spy satellites and missiles. He was a machinist who manufactured precision components, electronics components, printed circuit boards, and things like that for Russian spy satellites and missiles. And the thing is, his military records say that he was trained as a scope dope. He was trained to operate radar. He had no training whatsoever in how to build or maintain a radar set. So how did he get this job? How did he convince the Soviets he was qualified for this job? Maybe he got secret training. Well, who would give him training like that? Maybe Joseph Bates, maybe Leo Sweeney, and a whole bunch of other people involved in these cases. Well, where do the drugs come in? With Zodiac, it comes in with Vang Pao and eventually Frank Lucas. Well, here's the funny thing. When John Carr comes back to the United States and he's running around like a hunted animal, they're after me, they're after me. And his sister, Wheat Carr, has a boyfriend who told us that she used to complain about her family owing all these favors to the FBI. When it turns out that her father is a communist, they're not Irish. Their name isn't Carr. Their name is Tsar. They're Jews from the Ukraine, and they're communists. Her father was a communist. Her father was involved not only in the her father and her Aunt Julia were both hauled in by the FBI in connection with the Rosenberg Alger Hiss case. And before that, they're up to their eyeballs, and his wife Frances, they're up to their eyeballs in the Norton bomb site spy case, the Duchesne spy ring. Well, actually, there were two. There was the Duchesne spy ring, and there was one at the air base where the Carrs were stationed as counterintelligence. They were in charge of keeping spies out of that air base. I only mention it because Sam Walton was also counterintelligence. He worked in base security at a prisoner of war camp for German SS officers in Texas. And his son became a Green Beret. I'm sure most people know that. So it turns out these cases are not just vaguely connected. They're very tightly connected. There's a standard operating procedure here. You need to eliminate, we need to put the fear of God into some people. So we're going to go after their family members, mainly their kids. And they're going to get the message. If you kill the kid, fine. If the kid survives, fine. There are a couple people we need to liquidate, but then we're going to bump off some other people. Just send a warning message to some people. Keep their mouth shut about whatever, or to keep doing whatever. Just like the mafia, exactly like the mafia. Then you also have your friends in the mafia who help you with your spy work, and so you help them with their drug smuggling, and you all split the money. They say, well, we need to get rid of a couple of people too. And a lot of times it's the same person, right? It's like John Kennedy. Hundreds of people wanted Kennedy dead for hundreds of reasons. The LaBiancas, lots of mafia people wanted the LaBiancas dead for lots of reasons. You know that the LaBianca's daughter knew Charles Manson and lots of Papa, right? She actually lived in that same apartment. She knew those people. She knew all those people. Read Tom O'Neill's book, Chaos, okay? So the same thing now. The files are coming out. Josh Zeman got him, and now he's put them on the web. I don't know. Maybe I don't know. He's not taking credit for it. Same thing in Son of Sam. The victims, the witnesses, the ballistics, they're telling a very different story. And it turns out, like, for example, Carl Denaro, who was parking in a little VW with this girl named, they're all Italian. I can't keep their names.
I know. I can't remember her name. I know who you mean. I know that
Carl Denaro, because her dad was a cop.
Right.
She was Irish. It's Carl Denaro. Let me just Google it. Carl Denaro. The reason I bring it up is because it's not a coincidence. He is one of the Denaros. House Denari. Do you know they are? It's not Corleone. Corleone's like the second biggest name in the Sicilian mafia.
Yep, you're right.
The biggest name in the Sicilian mafia is Denaro, and
Absolutely.
he's not a 100th cousin. His grandfather Salvatore was one of the absolute biggest mafia guys who organized the docks in Red Hook in Brooklyn. His grandpa. And you've heard of Operation Underworld, where where the OSS recruited some Sicilian dock workers to go back to Europe and spy, right?
That's right.
Well, Carl's uncle Carmelo filled out a draft card, and he's never seen again ever. Because he was born in the old country, grew up in a Sicilian speaking household. They could infiltrate, maybe they couldn't infiltrate it back into Palermo, but they could infiltrate him into Marseille, they could infiltrate him into Casablanca, and he could work as a spy. He's not on he's not listed as killed in the war, and he never shows up again in America. So I think so Carl's stepfather, so it's Carl Denaro and I thought it was Rosemary Keenan.
Rosemary.
There's no way Carl's uncles would have approved of him going out with an Irish girl. I can testify to that. But be that as it may, he totally lies about what happened that night, because those police reports tell a totally different story. But to make a long story short, his stepfather, now he says his dad was never in the mafia stuff, that his dad his dad was born in the States. He had American citizenship. So as soon as his dad finished high school, he got out of town, went to upstate New York, and went to work in a hospital. It had nothing to do with his brothers. And maybe that's true. But Carl's mother divorces his dad, and they moved to Long Island. They moved to the heart of Denaro country. And there's just no way the family doesn't have an interest in young Carlos. So, to make a long story short, his stepfather, his mother remarries. She marries the senior vice president in charge of money laundering at Citibank at the exact time when you are busting Frank Lucas and replacing him with whoever it is that the Son of Sam murders is all about. And Carl's stepfather and his first cousin, maybe I won't mention his name, Frank Denaro Jr., who takes, he is the protege of, but his mother married a German guy. He's a senior vice president of money laundering at Citibank, and his apprentice, his protege, his assistant, who eventually takes his place when Gus Jacobs retires, is Carl's first cousin. That's why Carl gets shot at. I don't think they were trying to kill him. I think they were just sending a message. They're sending a message to his mother. Keep your mouth shut. And he won't admit that. But it's all the other victims are the same thing. Like some of the girls were delivering candy for this drug. They may not have known there was drugs in the candy boxes, but like Girl Scout candy, and then they hire kids to deliver it. Well, it's got a lot of these packages have drugs in them. That's what they're doing. It's all related to this, but not just any mafia drug smuggling operation, but the one connected with the CIA and the FBI and the KGB and the QLF. Because all these Quebecois people keep popping up. All these QLF people keep popping up in case after case after case. So all of this happened because I was just going to write some very boring book for the English professors to read about how the Zodiac killer letters were letters to the editors of the newspapers. So there's Tom O'Neill's Chaos. There's Now the granddaddy of all these cases is turns out to be the phony kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. Spencer, there's a guy named, the series of books is called The Dark Corners of the Lindbergh Kidnapping. Dark Corners of the Lindbergh. And he doesn't come up with a theory. His name is Michael Melsky, but you have to travel to New Jersey to get access, you have to physically go there and read the original police reports and things, which he has done exhaustively. And he just points out fishy thing after fishy thing. He tries not to push his own theory, but it's obvious this is not only one of these cases, it's the granddaddy of all the cases.
That's right. It does sound like that. Wow. This is...
And it involves not just spies, but it involves Nazis. It involves esoteric Nazis, occult Nazis. It involves the process church. It involves all of this stuff. And then at the appropriate moment, you get a disinfo prop who jumps up and takes control of the media circus and spins it off in a direction and just confuses everybody forever. Same thing happens in the Lindbergh case. Gaston Bullock Means is a big figure in the Lindbergh case. And then it turns out this goes back to Pancho Villa. And before Pancho Villa, it's William Walker. And before that, it's Andrew Jackson's covert invasion of Florida 200 years ago. This has been going on forever. And if there's a standard playbook, you make it look like a series of random, unconnected murders. You wait for a reporter to stumble over a possible link, and then you come out with your three-ring media circus disinformation propaganda campaign, like Ted Gunderson in Satanic Panic, like Maury Terry in The Ultimate Evil. Kernels of truth, but you spin it in a way that nobody will believe it, and they'll go off in the weeds, and they'll never be able to solve the crime. And it's the same playbook over and over and over.
Satanic Panic. I remember that. Oh my God.
There's a lot to it, but you get Ted Gunderson who comes along. Then you get the Danny Casolaro murder, or whatever it was that happened to Danny Casolaro. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing. And in that one, you get two popcorn spooks. You get Bob, what was his name? Bob Gibson? Not Bob Gibson. Bob Nichols. You get Bob Nichols and Jose Cuellar, Joe Cuellar. You get two popcorn spooks in one murder case. And it turns out it's all about Mike Riconosciuto. We used to call him Kid Laser. And that's actually all about Havana Syndrome. But I'm going to talk about that on my podcast. I can tell you what Havana Syndrome is. I can tell you who invented it. I can tell you who sold it to the Cubans and when. And I can tell you what it has to do with Zodiac. So going back to your original question about the attack on Cecilia Shepard.
Yep.
And Brian Hartnell.
I love the way you're bringing this all the way around, Professor. This is amazing.
Well, let me mention really briefly about Darlene Ferrin. She worked for Paperclip Nazis. There's a photograph of her with she and Jim were never legally married, but Jim Phillips Crabtree, his brother, photographed in the house that was owned by a Paperclip Nazi. Different from the one that she worked for the IHOP was owned by a guy who was raised in the Hitler Youth by his father, who was the co-founder of the German American Bund in the first place, and who spied for that guy turns out to be, his name is Schlager, turns out to be fascinating. Not only did Darlene work for them, but that picture of her and the unknown man, we found that house. That house at that time was owned by another Paperclip Nazi. And it all has to do with rocket science. It all has to do with Lockheed. It all has to, and that brings us right straight. It brings us right straight to John Benet Ramsey. So anyway, Jim and Darlene, not only does Darlene's dad do the same kind of work and work alongside, they have to brief each other, they help each other with all of this submarine technology. Not only that, but Jim turns out to be in town. Not his brother also worked as a machinist at the Cronin Naval Laboratory with Joseph Bates. And Jim was in the habit of staying with his brothers. And that October, when he and Darlene come back from the East Coast, her parents won't let him in the house. So he has to go down to Riverside and stay with his brother. And that's the exact time period when Sherry Jo Bates is murdered. And that's not the only murder that Jim's in town for. There's murders all over California that Jim makes a good suspect. Not that he's guilty, but he makes a good suspect for. And he always tries to pass himself off as some kind of spook. And looking at his address book and some other, I think he was Operation Chaos down in the Haight when he got out of the Army. because he was doing that stuff before the Summer of Love. And if you look at that's not Darlene's address book, that's Jim's address book. And I think that's the motive for Darlene's murder, was so that she couldn't tell anybody the significance of that address book. Be that as it may or may not be, the thing about Brian and Cecilia is I can't find any direct links between their parents and top secret stuff. Their parents were missionaries. Cecilia was born in India. Her father was born in India. They very rarely came to the States. Her parents, apparently, because her parents were the senior officials of this Seventh-day Adventist church in all of, not just India, but all of South Asia. He was the guy in the mission work there. Her father and her grandfather were the guys who ran the Seventh-day Adventist mission in India. So what? Well, both Gandhi and Annie Besant were very tight with the Seventh-day Adventists in India. As a matter of fact, to this very day, the Seventh-day Adventists have their big youth get-together at Annie Besant Park in Madras or Mumbai or someplace. Her parents knew Gandhi and Annie Besant, apparently. They must have. They had to, at least in a passing way. But that doesn't quite fit in. That whole case just sticks out like a sore thumb. The whole case does. And then it turns out that actually Leonard Lake turns out to be like the park ranger was probably his accomplice and may have even held the camera. Because Dennis Land turns out to be the best suspect I've ever seen for the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders.
I can't believe how they're all interconnected.
Once you look past the bullshit, pardon my language, I hope you don't have to bleep that out. Once you scrape away the disinfo prop, the myth, all these cases have a huge myth attached to them. Mm-hmm. There's a guy named Tom Westcott did the same thing with Jack the Ripper. There was no Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was a fictional character created by the newspapers. Those actual murders were carried out by a gang who were extorting the prostitutes, and then these prostitutes are acting like they're informants, so they get rubbed out. But like the murder of Polly Nichols, Marianne Nichols, supposedly there are no witnesses, and the body's just found on Bucks Row, which is a couple blocks off of the main drag, which is Whitechapel Road, which was busy all night long, all night fish shops, all night tea shops, all the stuff going on. So in real life, there were 12 witnesses who saw and heard Polly being dragged off. She was on the main street. She was on Whitechapel Road, saw two or three guys, I don't remember, drag her down the side street. There's from side to side of this very narrow street. We'd call it an alley today. There's a trail of blood that leads down from side to side of this alley, all the way down to Bucks Row, make a left, go down Bucks Row where the body was found. There were 12 witnesses. So the biggest newspaper in the East End of London was the Daily Echo, which is now online. And according to the Daily Echo story, there is now a rip gang working in Whitechapel, as in rip-off gang, not ripper like a murderer. The reporters turned it into that. There's a rip gang apparently working in the East in Whitechapel neighborhood. And the next day, the police captain gave a press conference where he said there is no rip gang and there were no witnesses in the Pollyann Nichols case, and there was no trail of blood. And Jack the Ripper is born. Well, to make a long story short, Danny Castellero's octopus murder, it's all connected. Philip Arthur Thompson ends up being connected. Armin Pellicetti, who was the first officer to arrive at the scene of the Paul Stein shooting and filed very suspicious reports and behaved very suspiciously, he ran interference for Philip Arthur Thompson for years at San Francisco Police Department.
Okay. Jeez.
And it's right. It's actually, and then you've heard of Drew Hurst Beeson. He actually has cracked. He has cracked. Take my word for it. You don't have to take my word for it. Watch these videos. He has cracked D.B. Cooper. But he goes in.
That's another interesting one.
Yeah. Well, it's like a club. It's like an association. It's like a union of former special forces guys who go freelance and they do jobs for anybody. And D.B. Cooper's one of them.
Yeah, that was. I think. Yeah, that's another fascinating case. Now that you bring that up too, the DVD Cooper one. But the way you're breaking this down, Professor, I mean, I definitely got to get you back for a part two because, I mean, this is so much bigger, but it's fascinating to me, and I love the way you're breaking this really down. I imagine some people are listening and going, "Why is he going into such depth?" About we started out the Zodiac murders, and then we kind of talked to Son of Sam and some of these other cases. But then I love the way you're kind of bringing this around, showing that how deep it goes for one, and how they're all basically related in some way or another. It's really a fascinating thing. And I've always said that to people too, Professor. I'm like, you have to start digging, scratching below what you're being told. I've always known that. Like you have to start digging a little. Don't just go by what people are telling you're hearing, because there's usually something deeper. And this is way deeper than I even imagined.
And the threads are coming together thanks to the internet. That's why we need to keep the internet free of censorship. Freedom of the press and freedom of speech are terrible. It's absolutely terrible what people use that for, but censorship is worse.
Yes, agreed. That's why I
The
love being
funny
here.
thing is, they've declassified stuff. I guess they've declassified the Bohannon stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Bohannon was the guy who wrote the CIA's textbook on counterinsurgency warfare. They've declassified all that stuff's declassified, and it's all right there. All the stuff I'm talking about, none of this stuff is witnesses I meet in the dark. None of it is stuff I can't show you on my podcast. I show you every single page. It's all government documents. It's all photographs. It's all old films that people have seen. And then you begin to realize, like people don't realize, the myth of Adolf Hitler. There's the myth of Hitler that Hitler himself created. Hitler wanted to be remembered in a particular way, and that's how he's remembered today. The problem is there's almost no truth to any of it.
I've heard this before.
And
Yeah.
the myth of Hitler is spookily similar to the myth of John F. Kennedy. There's a myth of Kennedy. And then you get this whole disinfo prop about the second gunman. That is CIA disinfo prop, because they don't want you to look at what really happened, because they don't want you to look too closely at Oswald. There is one very good, sometimes they get it right. PBS Frontline did a very good documentary, Who is Lee Harvey Oswald? They did an excellent job, although they didn't always know how to interpret the evidence that they found. But 5 of his cousins were in Marcello's mob. Ed Butler interviewed Oswald when he was fronting for the not Friendship for Cuba committee. What was it called? The Fair Play for Cuba committee. Ed Butler interviewed him for New Orleans radio. Well, a few years later, it's Ed Butler working at some stupid full color. It was kind of like it wasn't a very serious newspaper. It's Ed Butler who floats the theory of helter-skelter first, before the cops pick up on it. Did hate kill Tate? And it's Ed Butler. You see the same people pop up over and over.
Say that.
And
Why
over.
are the same people popping up in this?
There's Dr. Vernon. If you want to link between the West Memphis 3, the Fox Island pedophile murders, and a whole bunch of cases, but I'm just going to throw one out there, JFK. If you want to link between all 3 of those cases, Google Dr. Werner Spitz, and then pick up your jaw off the floor when you see all the cases he's been intimately involved with, including John Benet Ramsey. And then you look at the people who are around the Ramseys, the same thing. You look at the parents, what are they doing? You look at the parents, what are they doing? That tells you what's really going on. And all of these cases, it turns out that there is a myth that was created about the case. And when you finally get access to the actual files, the actual original files, guess what? They turn out to tell a totally different story. And that story is very spooky. And, right. It's not just me. I did it with Zodiac. Tom O'Neill did it with Manson. You've got Tom Westcott with Jack the Ripper. We're all racing to do Son of Sam. I kind of got the lead on that. I think
that's going to be really interesting. Makes total sense to name your book too. The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. I like the way that you've really brought this I wish we had another hour, Professor. I'm going to have to get you back. We only got a couple more minutes, and I want to make sure I give the last
anytime.
minute, yeah, to promote your channels and stuff, because and I'll make sure I leave links in the description for you can get all the find it. I'll make sure you got a link to his channel, his book, all that great stuff. I suggest you get the book, but I just like the way that you bring this out of the myth. I mean, and then kind of put faces to it and break some of the myth down. I think that's really fascinating that you've done that, and to really start showing what's below the surface. Because Zodiac is a myth, and then we get into Jack the Ripper, which I've looked into. That was another fascinating one, which I haven't looked into for a long time, but it was one of the first ones that I think catches people's eye and attention. So I just like the way you're breaking down the myth of this, and that's why I want to let you just go on this show and really just explain things. So you did an amazing job, and there's definitely another show here.
Yeah,
sure.
anytime.
Yeah, where can people find where can people find your work? I'm going to make sure they have a link for your book. So where can they find you?
That's the book. You need to read that book because, first of all, it debunks Grace Smith's book, and you need to get that garbage out of your head. The middle 1/3 of the book you could kind of skip. It's a very boring scholarly analysis of the history of vigilante journalism. And then you get the last 1/3 of the book where I go through the case files and I tell you what really happened, what the witnesses really said.
That's an awesome part.
Right.
Yeah.
And then identifying the person who wrote the original Zodiac killer letters, and his handwriting, as you can see in the book, is a perfect match. Then the series, if you can get it on Peacock, it was also on Oxygen at one point. They're like chapter 2. They went beyond this. They scored some amazing interviews. They went, is this possible? They got some confirmation from some experts. And then the next 300 or 400 chapters are on my podcast, which you can see on YouTube. The Stones Unturned podcast.
Perfect. And I will make sure I leave links for all of this, guys. Please check it out. Please check out the book. I can't recommend it enough. It was an amazing, amazing read. So much information there. The book is The Myth of the Zodiac Killer by Thomas Henry Horan, and that is going to wrap up this show, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, everyone in the chat. And I'll make sure I get the professor back on so we can dive into some more of this case and more information. I will see you guys on Thursday. Thank you for being here, and shout out to the 3 lovely ladies listening. If you're still listening, I'm looking forward to seeing you soon.